What if one of the most iconic figures in religious history never existed? For centuries, we've been told that Moses was real, a prophet, a lawgiver, a liberator chosen by God to lead a nation out of bondage and deliver divine commandments written in stone. His story is woven into the foundations of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He's appeared in sermons, classrooms, Hollywood epics, and children's books. But what if it's all fiction? No footprints in the desert, no Egyptian record of plagues or a mass slave uprising, no historical evidence of a man who supposedly split the sea, summoned miracles, and spoke directly to God. In this video, we're going to dismantle the legend of Moses, piece by piece. We'll examine the historical silence, the archaeological void, the contradictions within Scripture itself, and the uncanny similarities between Moses and older myths from Mesopotamia and Egypt. We're not here to disrespect tradition, we're here to challenge mythology disguised as history. And by the end, one thing will become clear: the story of Moses is not a biography. There is no historical figure of Moses, and no reason from archaeology or history to suppose any of the Exodus story is true, writes one journalist, summing up a growing scholarly consensus. This bold claim strikes at the heart of a saga celebrated by billions. The story of Moses, the prophet who defied pharaohs, parted a sea and led an enslaved people to freedom. How could such a foundational tale, immortalized in holy scriptures, epic films, and cultural memory, have no basis in fact? We begin in ancient Egypt over 3,000 years ago, where, according to the Bible, a baby boy set afloat on the Nile would change the destiny of a nation. But as we retrace his supposed steps from Pharaoh's palace to the peak of Mount Sinai, we must be prepared to find nothing. The trail of Moses is a trail of clues that lead not to a man, but to a myth. Let's follow it. In art and film, Moses is often depicted as the infant drawn from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in Egyptian luxury while carrying a secret destiny. The biblical book of Exodus introduces Moses with just such drama, a Hebrew baby saved from a royal decree of death. His mother, desperate to spare him from Pharaoh's order to drown Israelite boys, places him in a reed basket and sets it afloat on the river. The basket is found by the Egyptian princess, who pities the crying child and adopts him as her own, unknowingly hiring Moses' own biological mother as his nurse. In this remarkable twist of fate, the future leader of the Hebrews grows up in the very courts of the oppressor. From the very start, the Moses saga reads like legend. The perilous infant set adrift, the compassionate princess, the secret upbringing. It has all the hallmarks of what folklorists call the foundling hero motif. The young Moses, according to Exodus, lives a split identity, a Hebrew by birth, an Egyptian prince by upbringing. But when he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, Moses' blood stirs. He kills the Egyptian in a rash act of justice and is forced to flee into exile. In the wilderness of Sinai, he starts a new life, marrying into a Midianite family. Years pass, then comes the famous Epiphany. Moses encounters a burning bush that blazes yet is not consumed. From this fiery anomaly, God's voice commissions him to return to Egypt and liberate his people. A reluctant hero, Moses protests that he is not eloquent, so his brother Aaron is appointed as his spokesman. The stage is set for a showdown with the mighty Pharaoh of Egypt. Moses returns to confront Pharaoh with a simple demand tinged with divine authority: "Let my people go." What follows is one of the most dramatic sequences in any religious text: the 10 plagues of Egypt. The Nile turns to blood, frogs overrun the land, gnats and flies torment the people, livestock die, boils afflict the populace, hail and locusts decimate the crops, darkness covers the land, and finally the death of every firstborn son strikes Egypt. Each plague is a strike against the pride of a pharaoh who refuses to free the Hebrew slaves. Only after the 10th and most terrible plague, the night of Passover, does Pharaoh relent in grief and anger, driving the Israelites out. Moses thus leads a mass migration of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. The Bible says over 600,000 men plus families out of Egypt. No epic would be complete without a chase scene. Pharaoh's change of heart precipitates one. He pursues the Israelites with chariots, trapping them by the Red Sea. But Moses stretches out his hand and the waters miraculously part, allowing the Israelites to escape between walls of water. When Pharaoh's army follows, the seas crash back and drown the Egyptians. This moment, the parting of the Red Sea, is immortalized in film and song, a symbol of deliverance. But did it really happen? The silence of Egyptian chronicles, which we'll explore soon, is our first hint that we are dealing with metaphor, not history. Even ancient commentators struggled. Some suggested it was actually a shallow reed sea blown aside by wind, trying to demythologize the miracle. Ridley Scott's modern film depiction turned it into an earthquake-triggered tsunami. Yet outside of scripture and imaginative retellings, this event leaves no trace, a point we'll return to. According to the biblical account, the Israelites then trekked to Mount Sinai, where Moses received commandments and the law from God. Amid thunder and smoke atop the holy mountain, he spends 40 days and nights coming down with stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God. This is Moses, the law, moral and religious code that has echoed through Western civilization. The story doesn't end there. The Israelites, showing perhaps all too human fickleness, worship a golden calf in Moses' absence, prompting his fury and the smashing of the tablets. He intercedes with God to spare the people, carves new tablets, and the journey resumes. For 40 years, Moses leads the Israelites in the wilderness, a period of testing, rebellion, and revelation. He is their judge, prophet, and mediator. He strikes water from a rock, brings down manna from heaven, and lifts a bronze serpent to heal the sick. Yet he himself is destined never to enter the promised land because of one moment of anger. He struck a rock twice in frustration to draw water, betraying a lack of trust, as the story goes. In the final chapter of Deuteronomy, Moses dies atop Mount Nebo, glimpsing Canaan from afar. The text poignantly notes that no one knows Moses' burial place even to this day. It's as if the legend wants to leave him in a mysterious light, with no grave for pilgrims to visit or for skeptics to exhume. The biblical Moses is a figure of epic proportions, a prince-turned-fugitive, shepherd-turned-savior, lawgiver and nation-builder, a man who speaks face-to-face with God. A tale so impactful should have left some mark in the records of Egypt or in the archaeological footprint of the Sinai Desert and Canaan. We should find clues of plagues and exodus in Egyptian texts, traces of a large nomadic encampment in Sinai, signs of a sudden cultural intrusion into Canaan. We should be able to corroborate at least parts of this dramatic tale. Do we? The startling answer is, we do not. As archaeologist Philip Davies quipped, Moses himself has about as much historic reality as King Arthur. To understand why he said that, we must leave the realm of scripture and turn to history and archaeology, where Moses, if he existed, ought to be found. One of the first places to look for Moses outside the Bible is in the records of ancient Egypt. After all, if the Exodus happened as described, it would have been a cataclysmic event for Egypt, a massive slave population, allegedly on the order of 2 million people, including women and children, disappearing overnight, preceded by plagues that devastated the land and the death of Egypt's firstborn. Surely, one might think, the proud Egyptian civilization would have noted something, if not the plagues, which would be embarrassing to record, then perhaps the loss of so many slaves or an economic crisis. Yet in the voluminous hieroglyphic inscriptions and papyri that survive from the New Kingdom period, the era traditionally aligned with Moses, either the 15th or 13th century BCE, there is not a single mention of Moses or of an Israelite people sojourning in Egypt or of dramatic plagues that emptied the land. The silence is deafening. Egyptian scribes recorded everything from royal decrees to religious hymns to tales of victories in battle. We have detailed inscriptions of pharaohs bragging about their building projects and military conquests. We have administrative records listing slaves and their rations, even mundane documents about tomb workers' strikes, but nowhere do we find an account of a foreign population of slaves banding together and leaving en masse. As Professor Leon Levine of Hebrew University notes, there is no reference in Egyptian sources to Israel's sojourn in that country, and the evidence that does exist is negligible and indirect. A few artifacts show that people with Semitic names lived in Egypt. For example, Egyptian records mention Semitic slaves or workers in the Delta, and some Egyptian personal names like Moses or Aaron have Egyptian etymologies. But Levine rightly concludes, the few indirect pieces of evidence, like the use of Egyptian names, are far from adequate to corroborate the historicity of the biblical account. In other words, having a Hebrew hero with an Egyptian name is no proof he existed. It merely shows that the biblical writers knew that Egyptian names were plausible for someone in that era, much as a novelist today might give a character a convincing foreign name. What about the Pharaoh of the Exodus? The Bible pointedly never names him, he's just Pharaoh. Later tradition in Hollywood often cast Ramesses II in this role, since Exodus mentions the Israelites built the city of Pi-Ramesses, House of Ramesses, which was indeed constructed under Ramesses II around 1250 BCE. If that's the case, one might expect some hint in Ramesses' monumental inscriptions that a slave force he had employed somehow escaped. Instead, Ramesses II's inscriptions at places like Abu Simbel and Thebes boast of his victories, like the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, and list the temples and cities he built, including Pi-Ramesses, with no hint of disruption. His son Merneptah, who ruled around 1210 BCE, left a famous stele, an inscribed stone monument, which actually contains the earliest known mention of Israel in any ancient record. But it's not about Israel leaving Egypt, quite the opposite. The Merneptah stele, dated around 1208 BCE, is a victory hymn from Merneptah's campaign in Canaan. It declares Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. This tells us that by the late 13th century BCE, a people called Israel was present in Canaan, not in Egypt. Merneptah brags that he defeated them along with other Canaanite city-states. If those Israelites had recently escaped from Egypt under Moses, it's curious that Egyptian records only mention encountering them in Canaan as enemies to be subdued, with no reference to their dramatic departure from Egypt earlier. The stele treats Israel as just another foreign people in Canaan. Apologists often counter that Egyptians would be unlikely to record an event that humiliated them, like a defeat by slaves or disasters sent by a foreign god. It's true that ancient rulers tended to spin history in their favor. However, even if official propaganda ignored the Exodus, we might expect some echo of it in private records or later collective memory outside the Bible. We have Egyptian papyri that lament periods of chaos. For instance, the Admonitions of Ippur, a poem which describes a time when the Nile turned to blood, servants ran away, and darkness reigned. But Egyptologists have firmly dated Ippur's text to an earlier period, likely the Second Intermediate Period, many centuries before any plausible Exodus date, and interpret it as a poetic description of general calamity or a social upheaval, not a factual report. The parallels to Exodus plagues are superficial at best and likely coincidental or due to common literary themes of chaos. As one scholar bluntly put it, the Ippur papyrus only provides support for the Exodus tradition if one is woefully ignorant of broader Egyptian literature and history. In short, it's not the smoking gun Exodus proponents hoped for. Consider the magnitude of what the Exodus story claims. Egypt, the superpower of its day, was supposedly devastated by 10 sequential disasters. Its river, the lifeblood of the kingdom, became undrinkable. Its crops and livestock were destroyed, leading to famine. An entire generation of its firstborn, from noble families to commoners, died in one night. Then its slave labor force, which the Bible numbers in the hundreds of thousands, marched out. And if that weren't enough, the pharaoh's elite chariot corps perished in the sea. Yet none of Egypt's neighbors mention taking advantage of a weakened Egypt. None of Egypt's records mention a sudden collapse or loss. On the contrary, Egyptian civilization continued robustly in the supposed time after the Exodus. The successor of the pharaoh of the Exodus, whether it was Ramesses or another, did not lose control of Canaan immediately. Egyptian influence in Canaan persisted well into the 12th century BCE, as evidenced by Egyptian garrisons and artifacts found there. So how could Egypt retain an empire in Canaan if its army had been drowned and its economy ruined? The lack of any acknowledgement of nationwide trauma in Egyptian sources is a powerful argument that the biblical plagues and mass exodus did not occur as written. It's also worth noting what the Bible doesn't claim about the Israelites in Egypt. Contrary to popular misconception, the Israelites aren't said to have built the pyramids. Those were built around 2500 BCE, long before Moses. Even the biblical timeline would place Joseph and his brothers in Egypt much later. The slaves in Exodus are said to build the store cities of Pithom and Ramses in the Nile Delta. Archaeology has identified Ramses as Pi-Ramesses, which is modern Qantir, and possibly Pithom as a site in the eastern delta. These were indeed built with brick by slave labor under the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty. Egyptian records detail their construction, mentioning Semitic slaves often called apiru or other terms making bricks. In fact, tomb paintings like that of Rekhmir show foreigners mud brick making under overseers, which evokes the Exodus description of Hebrews making bricks with straw. This is real evidence that the biblical writers drew on genuine Egyptian motifs. The oppression of Semitic workers in Egypt was a historical reality. But here's the key point. Evidence of Semitic slaves in Egypt is not evidence of the Exodus. It's evidence that later Israelite storytellers knew their ancestors had some connection to Egypt or that forced labor was part of their ancestral memory. It lends authentic detail to the setup of the story, much as a historical novel might correctly describe ancient brickmaking. but it does not prove that those slaves left in a sudden exodus under a leader named Moses. In fact, modern historians and archaeologists suspect that the Exodus story was largely shaped in the first millennium BCE, centuries after the supposed events, by Israelites who perhaps had distant memories of Egypt. They may have known of the Hyksos, a Semitic people who did rule the Nile Delta and were expelled by Pharaoh Ahmose I around 1550 BCE, or they heard Egyptian tales of chaos and plagues from periods long past. These memories could have been refracted and woven into the narrative of a single dramatic escape. As Cambridge archaeologist Cyprian Broodbank observed, the Exodus is likely at best a refracted folk memory of earlier expulsions of Levantine people from Egypt. In other words, maybe something vaguely like it happened, not divine plagues and parted seas, but perhaps groups of Semitic people left Egypt at various times, and those memories converged into the legend of Moses. Even the name Moses is Egyptian, from Mos meaning born of, as in names like Amosi Thutmose, which suggests the story has an Egyptian setting indeed. But having an Egyptian name in a legend doesn't make the character real, it just adds a touch of realism. Jan Assmann, a renowned Egyptologist, makes a perceptive distinction. Moses is a figure of memory, not of history, whereas Akhenaten, the pharaoh who pioneered monotheism, is a figure of history, but not of memory. Akhenaten's revolutionary monotheism in the 14th century BCE was erased damnatio memoriae by later Egyptians, but rediscovered by modern archaeology. Moses' monotheism, by contrast, is a cultural memory treasured in religious tradition, but when we go looking for him in historical records, he vanishes. The conclusion drawn by most modern scholars is sobering. The Exodus, as described in the Bible, did not happen. As the respected archaeologist William Dever flatly states, the overwhelming scholarly consensus today is that Moses is a mythical figure. And as another archaeologist, Dr. Carol Redmount, summarized, there is no indication that the Israelites ever lived in ancient Egypt, and the Sinai Peninsula shows almost no sign of any occupation for the entire second millennium BCE. We will now turn to that Sinai evidence, or lack thereof, because if a throng of Israelites really wandered there for 40 years, it should not be invisible. The Exodus story doesn't end with leaving Egypt. In fact, the bulk of Moses' career, 40 years, is said to have been spent leading the Israelites through the wilderness of Sinai. The idea of an entire nation camping, moving, and living in a desert for 2 generations is logistically mind-boggling. They would need to find food and water for thousands of people and livestock daily. They would presumably leave behind campfires, pottery, tools, footprints of animal pens, even graves of those who died along the way. Yet, extensive archaeological surveys of the Sinai Peninsula and Negev Desert have turned up no evidence of a large population of fleeing slaves or any distinct Israelite presence during the time in question. For decades, archaeologists, including Israeli teams with a keen interest in their own heritage, have scoured the traditional route of the Exodus. They've identified many of the sites named in the Bible. For example, Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites supposedly stayed for 38 of the 40 years, has been excavated. What did they find? Nothing from the late Bronze Age, around 1500 to 1200 BCE, indicating a settlement or encampment. Kadesh Barnea, modern Ain Kudeirat, was uninhabited until much later. If hundreds of thousands of people camped there for years, we'd expect to find at least some shards of pottery or remnants of encampment. Ancient people, even nomads, made pottery, lost jewelry, discarded animal bones. The site is bare of such debris from Moses' time. Carol Redmount wasn't exaggerating when she said the Sinai shows almost no sign of any occupation for the entire second millennium BCE, the period roughly corresponding to the traditional era of Moses. The Sinai Desert, stark and vast, bears no scars from the passage of a nation. As one archaeologist famously remarked, if an army of 600,000 men, plus families, marched and camped in the Sinai for 40 years, they would have left behind a trail of artifacts 10 miles wide. Yet archaeology reveals only the occasional seasonal campsite of a few nomads here and there, nothing on the scale of Exodus. Let's consider the numbers given by the Bible. Exodus chapter 12 verse 37 says about 600,000 men on foot left Egypt, not counting women and children. Numbers chapter 1 verse 46 gives a precise figure of 603,550 men over age 20. If we include families, the total would be on the order of 2 to 2.5 million people. That is roughly the population of a major Egyptian city or the entire region of Canaan at the time. marching in a column that many people would stretch 240 kilometers or 150 miles long. The logistics are baffling. Consider how any group that size could find enough water in the desert each day. Apologists sometimes argue the number might not mean literal thousands. Perhaps the Hebrew word elef translated thousand could mean a clan or unit, drastically reducing the head count. But even moderate estimates, say 20,000 people, would still be an enormous caravan to sustain in a harsh environment and still should leave traces. All attempts to rationalize the numbers still strain credulity and have their own problems. And crucially, these attempts are modern retrojections. The biblical text itself unabashedly portrays an immense host. If that is a legendary exaggeration, it calls into question the entire historical accuracy of the account. Archaeologists have systematically surveyed areas like the central Sinai routes and the region around the traditional Mount Sinai, Jebel Musa in southern Sinai, as well as alternative routes proposed. Some suggest a route via northern Sinai, or that Red Sea was a marshy lake. None of these efforts have yielded evidence of a mass migration. No mass graves, no large distributed campsites, no distinctive Israelite artifacts. We do find evidence of other events. For instance, Egyptian inscriptions on rocks in Sinai attest to Egyptian mining expeditions for turquoise and copper at Serabit el-Qadim during the Bronze Age. Those miners left inscriptions and pottery fragments. Comparatively, a whole nation's worth of camps would have left much more, yet there is nothing to show. As Rabbi Bert Vysotsky candidly admitted, the biblical Exodus route into the Sinai desert has left no trace other than what the Bible tells us. There is virtually no evidence, as the Torah says, that 600,000 Israelite males, with their wives and children and elders, left Egypt in the Exodus. This is coming from a religious scholar who cherishes the story, but he acknowledges the empirical reality. Let's pause on that. Virtually no evidence. We live in a time when archaeology can detect even small, fleeting habitations. For example, archaeologists can find the stone post holes and flint tools of a few families of hunter-gatherers from 10,000 years ago in the Negev. They can identify distinct layers of remains distinguishing Canaanite villages from Philistine settlements from Israelite towns by subtle differences in pottery and animal bones. With methods like satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and good old-fashioned digging, if there were hundreds of encampments littered with debris from even a few thousand nomads moving through Sinai around 1200 to 1400 BCE, we would likely have found some by now. But as Dr. Carol Myers summarizes, after a century of searching, archaeologists and Egyptologists have found no evidence which can be directly related to the Exodus. Certainly no Egyptian sources mention Moses or the events of Exodus, and no archaeological evidence has been discovered in Egypt or the Sinai wilderness to support the story. That is a comprehensive negation. There's also the issue of geography and anachronism. Some places mentioned as stops in the wilderness journey were unknown or uninhabited in Moses' day. We already noted Kadesh Barnea wasn't settled in the late Bronze Age. The Bible's list of camping sites, in Numbers chapter 33, includes names that likely came into use later. One site, Ezion Geber, is archaeologically dated to the 8th to 6th century BCE, though possibly with a 12th century phase, suggesting that name might have been updated by later authors. Moreover, the narrative context sometimes fits later realities better than the supposed time of Moses. For example, Exodus chapter 13 verse 17 says that God did not lead the Israelites by the route through Philistine country because they might see war and lose heart. But in, say, 1440 or 1250 BCE, two common proposed dates for the Exodus, the Philistines had not yet settled the coastal region in force. They arrived around 1200 BCE. There wouldn't have been a Philistine way in Moses' time, whereas in the 7th to 6th centuries BCE, when many scholars believed the Torah was compiled, the Philistines were well-known inhabitants of that area. Likewise, Exodus portrays Pharaoh worrying that the Israelites might ally with foreign invaders, as mentioned in Exodus chapter 1, verse 10. In the late Bronze Age, Egypt controlled Canaan tightly and faced no major threat from the northeast. Canaan was essentially Egyptian territory. Only much later in the first millennium did Egypt fear invasions from empires like Assyria or Persia coming through Palestine. These contextual clues hint that the story was shaped against a backdrop that made sense to writers in a later era, not to someone who lived through events in the late Bronze Age. Another glaring anachronism is the use of camels, Exodus 9 verse 3, includes camels among Egyptian livestock affected by a plague. However, camels were not common domestic animals in Egypt or the Levant until the very end of the second millennium or later. Camels became widespread in the Near East around the 10th century BCE. Finding camels in a story set in 1500 to 1200 BCE is like finding colonial American characters driving cars, a subtle hint of a storyteller living in a later period retrojecting their reality back in time. The cumulative effect of all this. Archaeology and historical geography strongly suggest that the Exodus narrative was written or edited many centuries after the purported events, by people who may have known bits of history but largely were creating a national epic. As Israel Finkelstein and Neil Silberman famously wrote in The Bible Unearthed, after reviewing the lack of evidence for Exodus and conquest, the Exodus story does not represent a specific historical moment. Instead, it seems to be a foundation myth of the Israelite people. This doesn't mean it was concocted from thin air. Like many myths, it likely blends various memories, experiences, and symbolic themes. We've touched on how Egyptian and desert details in the story show familiarity with real settings, but those details alone don't make it true, they just make it plausible to ancient listeners. The story was perhaps intended less as a history lesson and more as a theological and cultural narrative explaining who the Israelites were, people delivered by their God from slavery, bound to him by a covenant and forged in hardship into a nation. It's a powerful identity-shaping tale, but as far as we can tell, not a report of literal events. If Moses didn't exist, then who brought Israel its laws and religion? The simplest answer is many people over many centuries. The idea that a single figure authored all the laws and wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, is not supported by the text itself, which shows signs of composite authorship. As early as the 19th century, scholars of the documentary hypothesis noticed doublets and contradictions in the Torah that suggested multiple sources. For example, sometimes Moses' father-in-law is named Reuel, other times Jethro. Mount Sinai is sometimes called Horeb, and 2 versions of water from rock miracles occur in Exodus 17 and Numbers 20 at different locations with different outcomes. One account says the Israelites encountered quail and manna, as in Exodus chapter 16, while another account in Numbers chapter 11 gives a different story about quail. The 10 Commandments appear twice with slight differences in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. These are clues that the Moses story was woven together from several traditions long after the supposed time of Moses, by editors who sometimes left the seams visible. Modern biblical scholarship generally dates these sources to the first millennium BCE, for example, a Yahwist source in the 9th century, an Elohist perhaps in the 8th, Deuteronomy in the 7th, and a priestly source during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th to 5th century. This means the narrative of Moses reached the form we have now, at least 600 to 800 years after any possible historical Moses would have lived. In that span of time, legend can grow exponentially. Think of how the figure of King Arthur just 1500 years ago accumulated mythic accretions, dragons, wizards, magic swords, within a few centuries. For Moses, we see a similar legendary layering, except that we don't even have a core historical figure we can confidently identify. As Dever said, Moses is mythical, a collective creation rather than an individual recalled by reliable memory. Before we declare the case closed, we must consider one more dimension: comparative mythology. Many elements of Moses' story have uncanny parallels in older tales from the ancient Near East. These suggest that the storytellers who shaped his legend drew on well-known motifs and perhaps specific stories from surrounding cultures. We've already mentioned a few, like the baby in the river and receiving laws on a mountain. Let's now delve into those parallels. They will show just how unoriginal in a sense the Moses saga is. Far from being a unique, divinely dictated history, the Exodus narrative appears to be a tapestry woven from the cultural heritage of the region. Long before the Hebrews told of Moses' birth, another story of a foundling baby set adrift on a river was cherished in Mesopotamia. That is the legend of Sargon of Akkad, a famous king who ruled around 2300 BCE, over a millennium before any plausible date for Moses. If you enjoy our content, we'd love your support. By joining one of our channel memberships, you help us continue creating videos like this one while gaining access to some amazing perks. As a member, you'll unlock exclusive content available only to supporters, earn loyalty badges to show off in comments and live chats, and enjoy priority responses to your comments, shoutouts, and more. The best part? Memberships start at just $2.99 a month, less than a cup of coffee. Even small contributions make a big difference for the PJ Bible TV team in covering production costs and delivering the content you love. And if you're not ready to become a channel member today but still want to support us, there are other ways to help. Engaging with our videos is a tremendous way to show your support. By taking just a few moments to like the video, share it with friends, family, or on social media, and leave a comment, you're telling the YouTube algorithm to share our content with more people. Your support, no matter how you choose to show it, means the world to us. Thank you for being part of the PJ Bible TV community.